Hello, I am Prometheus, and this is Book Suds. After procrastinating for a few months, I am finally doing a review of Power of the People by Carol Sue Tombari, I believe. Power of the People, America's New Electrical Choices. The book overall was pretty decent. I agree that America's infrastructure is, at this point, almost 100 years old and really could do with a revamp. I do disagree with certain other things she says, and as you can see, I have a bunch of tabbies. So let's attempt to go through each one, and I will attempt to discuss each of the points as quickly as possible, and what I thought about it. Oh my. Okay, first point. Take, for instance, industrial motors. They're the single largest electrical consumer in the industrial sector, using 65% of all electricity consumed in the industry. In many industrial facilities today, there are two speeds, on and off. By replacing them with variable speed motors, industries could reap a 60% energy savings with an impressive return on investment. To my knowledge, the reason why these motors would have two speeds is to A, save on things like resistors, which would be necessary for the variability, or capacitors, or I'm not an electrician, so forgive me if I screw up on the terminologies. They only need to run at a certain RPM to do a certain task for the most part. Kind of like how your dryer spins slow, then spins fast, then spins slow, then turns off. So I'm not exactly sure where this 60% energy saving is coming from. Yes, you would save energy if you ran at a slower speed, but is there a reason why they have that RPM to begin with? The next one. Picture a graph on the vertical y-axis measuring the concentration of greenhouse gases, and the horizontal x-axis marks years. Picture a J-curve of data points jumping abruptly upward, roughly coincidentally with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. This is the famous hockey stick graph. It is especially dramatic when plotted for carbon dioxide. It seems breathtakingly ostrich-like to me, but in the year 2007 there are still people who concede that the planet is warming but question whether or not the causes are largely anthropogenic. My own opinion is we did it. Well, she's adding her opinion to it, and that's perfect. That's within her right, it is her book. But isn't the hockey stick graph the one where the temperature also rises, discredits the 40s warming, not the 40s, the 1930s warming, and ignores the medieval warming? Medieval warming? Yeah. This graph has had some criticism over the years, and yeah, we're probably the ones putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but carbon dioxide tends to come after the warming. The only reason why the carbon dioxide is coming before the warming in this time of the spectrum is because we dug it up first and made some nice energy out of it, if I do say so myself. Ooh, a twofer. Earth actually has a kind of circulatory system called the thermohalion cycle, you know, the Gulf Stream. It's a phenomenon that creates strangely warm currents off otherwise cool land masses and keeps places such as England and Ireland from becoming uninhabitable during the winter. You mean dropping to temperatures like what Russia experiences? I mean, London is pretty near the same latitude as Moscow, and Finland's even higher, and yet they still seem to do fairly fine. That's just me. The many systems are complex and interrelated. Predictive models, while improving, do not begin to capture the many mechanisms and feedback loops. This is why some of the early climate models in the 1960s and 70s predicted global cooling rather than warming. Today's climate change naysayers use these errors of those primitive early models to justify their skepticism. And this is where I will say, you had something that put out a negative, and now you're getting a positive, and you suggest that we trust it? You put out a false report once, and then you did another report with the same inherent flaws in the system that haven't been properly comprehended, and you expect us to trust this report because it's the second one. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, the bad. Oh, and this is in the nuclear fuel section. What wonderful. Nuclear fission is an extremely complicated way to heat water to produce steam, and it powers generators. A large nuclear plant has some 40,000 valves, 10 times more than coal or oil plants of a similar size. In addition, fuel rod temperatures reach a searing 4,800 degrees, placing significant demands on the material science to withstand this brutal thermal punishment. Yes, nuclear reactors do have a lot more valves than coal plants. That's because you need a lot more safety features, especially with things like boiling water and pressure water reactors, which are inherently kind of touchy when you get to those larger power things. 16 megawatts thermal? Great, you can handle it with less valves. But once you start getting into those 700, 800 gigawatts, when you're about ready to power DeLoreans, you're going to need to choose another reactor design because water is a little touchy. And as far as I know from reading other books, Arion will hopefully put in a thing. Fuel rod temperatures on the inside occasionally reach 4,800 degrees, but no reactor engineer ever wants it to reach 4,800 degrees because uranium oxide, which as far as I know is the main type of fuel instead of metallic uranium, it melts at like 200, 250 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not very good at heat, and so they tend to keep it lower. Also, the water temperature is only around 900, so inside the fuel rods, yes, but all in all, it's not that hot. Here we go. Now, it continued on, and she mentions how they wanted how she visited a nuclear reactor and how the plant reactor operators basically were high school graduates, and that's all that they had training for, and that's how the reactors were designed, to be trained by fairly simpletons, but good enough. Oh boy. About 6 months later, in 1979, a valve stuck open in one of the reactors of 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generator Station near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Primary coolant was lost. This was a pressure water reactor, one of the first ones, mind you, and caused a partial meltdown of the core. This is known as China syndrome, so named because the nuclear core meltdown theoretically could generate enough heat to melt its way through the Earth to countries on the opposite side of the globe. It took years to sort through what had gone wrong at 3 Mile Island, and it took 14 years and $1 billion to clean up the mess at the problematic Unit 2 reactor. Yes, steam was lost. Yes, some radiation got out. Was it life-threatening? No. It was a big scare. And China syndrome, while nuclear fuel, when it's melted down, is hot and does melt through quite a bit, you're not going to get China syndrome. That was 1970s cheesy movie film theatrics. You know, kind of like that one, what is it, Volcano, where LA becomes a volcano or whatever. It's like that. No. In the 1980s, there was a far worse disaster at Chernobyl. This is right after that finished paragraph, by the way. In Russia's Ukraine region, leaked radioactivity was blamed for hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths, as well as the birth of mutant animals such as three-legged calves. Regardless of the horrifying hype, the region is still feeling the effects of this terrible accident. Okay, I probably should give her credit for saying, regardless of the horrifying hype, such as I don't think there were any reports of three-legged calves. I don't know if that was a thing. There's probably a few pictures of that, and there were probably some defects. But Chernobyl was blamed for 28 deaths due to acute radiation syndrome. 2 more were killed instantly in the blast, and that's the official thing. That's the official number. And out of the hundreds of thousands of liquidators, it's believed that 3,000 of them have died due to effects of radiation, but still lived somewhat normal lives, just a shortened lifespan by about 10 years. Still, 10 years, quite a lot. The Chernobyl reactor was a stinking dynamite cask in a tin can. There was no containment building, it was an inherently unstable design, and despite that, it still ran fairly well for 2 years. and it was built improperly and didn't have the materials that it was supposed to have. So all in all, given that there was a similar incident like this in the chemical industry, Bhopal, India, and that killed 20,000 people, the worst nuclear accident kind of pales in comparison to that. That was my rant. Now, I wonder what this is. Nuclear power has been anything but cheap to has been anything but too cheap to meter, which was a promise made in the 1960s. Coming in between 2 cents per kilowatt hour at old depreciated plants and a higher capacity factor to as high as 15 cents per kilowatt hour. I do not know where she got these numbers because whenever I try looking it up in my old books and on the internet, it comes in between 0.06 and 0.013 cents per kilowatt hour, which is roughly comparable with coal and cheaper than oil. I don't know where she got this number. Oh, there was this wonderful. She has a hydropower costs around 2 cents, natural gas around 8, new coal 5 cents per kilowatt hour. I probably should, or more, depending on the rail hauling rates and whether a carbon penalty is enacted. Energy efficiency at 2 or 3%, winds at around 5%. All costs are approximations. Not only does costs vary by technology, it also differs among utilities and it changes over time. The cost of construction for any technology that uses steel or cement, for example, has risen significantly in recent years due to the world's demand for these commodities. By Silverstein, Limelight. I'm going to hold off on my opinions on that one. Okay, what do we have here? We would be remiss if we did not consider the fact that uranium, which is processed to produce nuclear fuel, is a depleting resource. It was mined heavily during the Cold War, and now the resource is under further stress. As China, India, and Russia plan new nuclear power plants, the cost of uranium is trending sharply upward from $10 per pound a few years ago to $85 per pound in 2007. In America, just as no new power reactors were permitted after 1978, there are also no new investments in new uranium mines or production facilities. Worldwide uranium processing is adequate to meet only 65% of the current reactors' requirements, much less planned growth. Currently, we rely on Russia for half of our nuclear fuel under the Swords to Plowshares program that converts some 20,000 Russian nuclear weapons to fuel. That agreement will end in 2013. Ironically enough, she just explained why uranium is going up. In the Cold War, we had a bunch of uranium mines operating to produce plutonium for bombs and for reactors. This is how it works. After the SALT limitation treaty, we didn't quite need so many nuclear bombs. So the benefits of and subsidies that the government was using for these mines kind of died away, as uranium also was getting a pretty bad rap due to the hippies and that one guy from the Sierra Club that got kicked out. And yeah, that's all I have to say on that. The national security risk. The United States doesn't reprocess its spent fuel. France, however, does. To date, there have been no incidences that we are aware of recycled nuclear material falling into terrorist hands. I think that's more of a... Oh. Sorry, let me go back and reread that properly. Did I say uranium is depleting? That's because the United States uses its nuclear fuel only once, disposing of the spent fuel. Technologically, however, it is possible to recycle spent nuclear fuel, what is distressingly called a breeder reactor, but reprocessing creates the opportunity for nuclear fuel to fall into the terrorist hands. I personally see this as a cop-out, as, like she said, there have been no incidences of nuclear material falling into terrorist hands. The government just doesn't want to get around to dealing with the mind-boggling minutiae of their regulatory system, which is a hot mess. And if you think that getting the permits for a restaurant or catering business are bad, you should see what it's like for a nuclear power plant. It is god-awful, and that costs somewhere between $6 and $9 billion today. Just lovely. Okay, and yes, as far as I know, we only do use it once, and it would be much better if we could reprocess it in breeder reactors. I'm currently kind of obsessed about thorium salt reactors, but that's just me, whatever. A third of the country, Nevada in the western third, we're talking about as many as 2,000. Oh, it's talking about how much of the nuclear power plants are situated in the eastern third of the country, and Nevada in the western third. We're talking about as much as 2,000 miles of transport on U.S. highways through the heartland. Instead of the nation's high-level nuclear power plant waste is stored on-site in cooling ponds at power plants across the country. Don't forget the Homeland Security risk. Terrorists could steal fissionable material and make a bomb for detonation anywhere. Atomic bomb-grade material is not needed to build a dirty bomb. Another Homeland Security risk is the possibility of a terrorist who could fly a plane into a nuclear facility. Supposedly, the containment building structure is designed and constructed to withstand such a blow. Luckily, we did not have had an occasion to find out. Too cheap to meter? Not hardly. Yes, I did hear that most of our nuclear power plants are on the East Coast, and don't get me started on Yucca Mountain. That was a horrible place to bring it, and why did I bring that up? I don't know, but yes, we did build those atomic containment buildings for the pressure water reactors to mainly withstand the steam explosions if a loss of coolant happened, but also we did have a jet aircraft, I think it was an F-4, flying at 500 miles at a rail, crash into a block of it. I'm pretty sure you can look it up on the internet. It's a very fascinating video. So as far as we can tell, they'll survive. Obviously, that should be looked into a little more. And yes, we do keep the atomic waste nearby just because it's less of a pain to transport. I mean, which is worse? Transporting highly radioactive material and lead pig on U.S. highways with crazy drivers, or just sticking it in the backyard? I'm going with sticking it in the backyard. People drive nuts these days. Oh, here we go. Wonder why I skipped all that. Distributed generation. To integrate renewables into the utility system will require a very different model of electrical generation, transmission, and distribution. Incredibly, and lucky for us, it will likely be cheaper than just adding more of the same old to today's electricity grid. Simply building into today's grid is currently designed is not the most, as it is currently designed, is not the most efficient solution in any case. Recall that today's grid is not strictly speaking one grid. It is in fact 3 regional grids that are not always connected where we need them to be and not necessarily in sync with one another so that electricity can flow easily to where we want it to go. Most important for the purpose of this discussion, the grid was not designed to transmit electricity generated from renewable resources. Consequently, high voltage wires do not reach into remote sunny and windy regions. This creates stranded assets of sun and wind that can't be tapped for their electrical generating potential. Upgrading the efficiency and adding enough high power transmission capacity to meet our anticipated needs, if we simply build onto the current model, would cost billions for transmission additions alone. Given the myriad of other pressures like our national wallet, this isn't an investment that's likely to be made. There's kind of a reason why we do this. America's huge, and you need certain places are just more convenient economically and sometimes practically to build a power plant. Like a coal plant is convenient near A, coal mine, and B, a rail station. That's where it's convenient to put one. As it also happens, it doesn't really matter where the coal mine happens to be, because where there is a coal mine, there is people, which means you don't have to transmit it too far, and if you do have to transmit it far, well, high voltage AC tends to do the trick. As it also happens, sunny places like the Mojave Desert haven't exactly attracted people because it's desert. It's not exactly what humans call habitable, and windy places tend to be windswept plains and or mountains. Again, debatable whether or not that's useful. And I'm back. Stranded assets. Picture, if you will, today's model: a large central power station, a nuke, a coal plant with associated coal piles and multiple railway sidings, or natural gas transmission lines lead away from it and deliver electricity to distribution points. From there, distribution lines lead to your neighborhoods, homes, and businesses. In today's model, electricity flows one way, from the power plant to you. Well, it kind of flows back through the neutral wire, but that's really just an annoyance to deal with the positive AC curve. It technically does flow back a little bit, but yeah, it for the most part goes one way. What if, however, you were to generate some of your own electricity? What if you put solar electric panels on your roof and actually fed electricity back into the line at sunny times when your system generated more electricity than you needed? If you own a commercial warehousing facility with a large flat roof and that urban roof could be a veritable field of solar electric arrays that could become a mini power plant generating electricity and feeding it back into the grid for consumption somewhere else in the system. I'm going to mention a few of these things. Why is it that generating electricity from solar panels and feeding it back into the grid is a good idea, but plugging in a generator into my wall socket and potentially backfeeding into the grid is a bad idea? I don't know. Yeah, it would be nice if I could generate all my electricity right here, cut down on transmission costs by, well, almost all of them. Then again, there comes the problem of sun. Like where I live, Kentucky, sun happens to be less obstructed by clouds in the fall and winter. In spring and summer, it's rainy and or cloudy, which is kind of annoying. But that's our system. New England, not north of England, New England area, I've heard they get a lot of rain. Also, they only get like 4 peak sun watt hours. We get like 5 or 6 down here. You could generate your electricity, but whether or not you're going to ever generate enough to feed back into the grid, is that really worth the investment of putting them on your roof? I don't know. Now picture our utility model as described above, but add these multiple mini power plants located at the point of consumption, i.e. your home or business. These power plants would be powered by solar, wind, or both. They could also be powered by biomass. Urban biomass suppliers could include landfill, gas, urban wood waste, suburban lawn trimmings. In rural areas, biomass could also come from plant and animal wastes, and perhaps even dedicated fuel supply crops, such as switchgrass, drought-resistant prairie grasses, or fast-growing poplar trees. Large facilities such as hospitals, schools, or industries could install fuel cells and create microgrids in building complexes and neighborhoods. Okay, wind and solar, they don't work all the time. I think they have a standard of being on a third of the year or 10% of the year or something like that. Urban biomass, while it sounds good, tends to also burn plastics when it gets desperate, and that, as we somewhat know, plastic burning is not ideal in an urban setting. Also, there have been cases of burning treated woods such as arsenic-treated railroad ties and creosote railroad ties, which obviously hasn't gone over well with the local communities. Also, why would you use useful land for growing switchgrass, prairie grasses, and poplar trees? Poplar trees, I mean, I think I have one, like a tulip poplar or something. I have one. The property I'm currently living on has a poplar tree. And first off, how long does that take to grow? Also, if I remember my BTUs per pound, or calories per gram, coal puts out 20,000 BTUs per pound, whereas wood tends to be between 4,000 and 7,000 BTUs per pound. I'll have Ariane put in the numbers for calories and grams because I don't know those off the top of my head, sorry. Yeah. Also the fuel cells. What fuel? There are 2 fuel cells that I know of. One, the hydrogen and oxygen. That you need to split the hydrogen and oxygen because hydrogen for some reason doesn't like to stay around and prefers to detonate itself when you do separate it from oxygen. And the other one is the carbon oxygen cell, which turns to CO2 anyway. It's a bit more efficient than thermal cycles, but you still get CO2 out of it. I don't even know if that's been built yet. I'm sure it has been built since then. Okay, supposedly a bunch of these mini power plants will eventually get rid of the bigger power plants and get rid of the need for adding nuclear coal plants. This is what I'm this is something I've heard, but the reason why we build these things ridiculously huge is because the thermal efficiencies tend to go up the bigger you build them. Like the giant diesel engine used by the tugboats in the harbor have a higher thermal efficiency than, say, the diesel engine in a pickup truck. I've heard that. I'm not entirely sure if that's accurate, but that's what I've heard. And then I was talking about how in 1990 the Sacramento Municipal Utility District lost its ability to make a nuclear power plant in the area, and so they figured out that they could install 2 megawatts of photovoltaics on site of the mothball nuke, 5 megawatts of wind, 134 megawatts of geothermal electricity, and 4 megawatts of photovoltaics distributed on the residents' rooftops. The Sacramento Utility District Rooftop Photovoltaics Program, that's not a mouthful, provided an increasing model for other utilities. The utility owned the photovoltaic arrays and used the homeowner's roof, similar to leasing land for wind farms. Utilities with the obligation to serve are understandably nervous about turning over the keys to the car in terms of letting others generate the system. Whether they are industrial co-generators or dispersed small generators, the Sacramento Utilities District retained ownership of the equipment and controlled the operation of the system. In addition, the Sacramento area was able to reduce its peak load by 12% through energy efficiency. It planted 30,000 shade trees. I wonder how that affected the solar panels on the rooftops. I don't know, maybe I'm just crazy. Reducing indoor cooling requirements as much as 40%. It helped customers purchase more than 42,000 super efficient refrigerators that provided rebates for cool rooftops with sun reflective coatings, and the Sacramento spent 8% of its gross revenues on energy efficiency and succeeded in holding rates constant for 10 years, in contrast to rates that had skyrocketed by 80% at utility completed constructions of the nuclear. In contrast, rates would have skyrocketed 80% had the utility completed the construction of the nuclear power plant. My question is that because of the technology, the fuel, or the fact that it's being regulated to death? There's a ton of nuclear regulations. Efficiency is great, but people would never have been able to get this efficiency had the power company not footed the bill. And the only reason why the power company bothered to foot this bill is because they were probably worried of running out of power. Or maybe I'm just projecting it. Because whenever somebody mentions efficiency, it seems more like you're pinching pennies because you're worried that you don't have it in your budget. Kind of like having to budget every single meal for the week, because if you splurge on that one meal that you want to get that one day, you'll completely ruin your budget and you'll be starving for 2 days somehow. That's just what it seems like, and I think I've gone off the rails again. Buildings. Oh yeah, fun little tidbit that I heard of, that 134 megawatt geothermal. Geothermal produces 200 times more radioactive waste because of the thorium coming out of the earth than a nuclear plant does per kilowatt hour produced. It's just, geothermal's basically just a really bad natural reactor. And I don't know what they do with the radioactive waste. I'm pretty sure it's not contained in buildings.